Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Office 365, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Really looking forward to this one because there's a lot to say about Office 365. Some of it good, some of it bad, definitely some of it ugly. You're going to get the straight dope, as always, from Real Story Group. We've just completed some pretty landmark research into the platform as a whole, additional kind of critical methodology. I'm going to share some of the highlights of that with you here today. Now, one quick note, we had originally planned to do this live. The holidays intervened on us, and so this is a recording. So unfortunately, you won't be able to ask any questions in real time. However, I will invite you to send any questions to info@realstorygroup.com, the email address that you see on the bottom there, and we'll definitely get back in touch with you. The other thing to let you know is that all of you are going to get a copy of today's deck. So if you want a full PDF, you'll be getting that. Those of you where your employers are already Real Story Group subscribers, you'll get access to a full video playback as well that you can share with your peers within your enterprise. Okay, so with that said, let's get into it. Many of you may be new to Real Story Group. We're a research and advisory firm. We sell our research through 3 different subscription offerings. One is sort of a self-service mode where you get access to our critical evaluations and then analyze the strengths and weaknesses of different tools and make decisions against that. Second one is sort of an assisted mode where you get access to us through email and by phone, and we help you through your decision making. And then finally, we have a kind of a guided mode where we step you through in more detail particular types of roadmap or product selection projects. We're different from almost every other analyst firm in the world in as much as we never, ever work with vendors. We don't advise them on their roadmaps. We don't consult with them. We don't let them buy us stuff. We don't let them take us on junkets. We don't accept hospitality from them. We don't write white papers from them. They can't mention us in their press releases. And so this gives us a chance to tell you the real story about what's actually going on among different vendors. And I'm proud to say that I think our Office 365 research is probably the most independent and hard-hitting that you'll see out there. So those of you who do know us know we've been covering digital workplace and marketing technologies for a long time now. We've been publishing this subway map for the last 10 years to sort of visualize all the different vendors that we evaluate. You see the light blue line is web content and experience management, the red line, enterprise collaboration, social software, enterprise portals on the green line, and then a whole set of other digital marketing lines here as well. One of the things that's interesting, of course, is that we've got Microsoft Dead Center. Microsoft is active in a number of these different spaces, and certainly for the digital workplace lines here, Office 365 is now its kind of main go-to solution. So the agenda today is to look at just what is Office 365? What do the products actually do? We're going to do a deep dive on our groups evaluation. So in our research, we evaluate 13 key Office 365 services. I'm going to share a little bit about what we think about groups. And I'm going to finish up with some trends for you to think about, in particular in connection with Office 365 and your broader digital workplace. So if you look at employee experience technology, you can break it up into a lot of different segments here. We tend to bucket these things by collaboration and communication at top, self-service in the kind of purple middle there, and then human capital management and major business lines along the bottom. And you can see that there's a lot of vendors here. We've got 200 different products from 160 different vendors. So obviously your digital workplace is pretty sizable. Potentially your employees having to interact with a number of different tools. But I think it's also safe to say here, though, that particularly when it comes to collaboration, communication, and the sort of knowledge worker type activities, Microsoft obviously plays a pretty ubiquitous role here. And in nearly all these services, they're agglomerating into the Office 365 stack. And in fact, that's a big part of their go-to-market, is to say, look, you can license Office 365 from us, and then you can start removing some of these other logos from your digital workplace and really simplify, at least from an invoicing and vendor standpoint, simplify your environment, because it's just all Microsoft, right? And it's a very persuasive argument from a financial standpoint. Not always clear as a persuasive standpoint from an employee experience standpoint, which is a totally separate issue. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But obviously, Microsoft really astride this part of the employee experience landscape. And what is Office 365 is really, it's a modern version of Microsoft's take on this, but also a kind of a reaction to the past, where we had these large on-premise estates around Exchange, certainly, for sure, SharePoint, our desktop Office 365 environments, and we invested a lot in these and tended to sort of ground them, but at a certain point, they also became too big and unwieldy and expensive to maintain. So the promise of Office 365 here is more like, hey, we're going to be this new, modern, mixed-use community, right? It's not going to be this old, fluffy, stoic, static, heavy chateau. At least that's the promise. The reality is that maybe this isn't quite as adaptive as we would think. Sometimes the up escalator actually goes down. There's no building codes here, and all kinds of random things get appended. Sometimes the flowers die on the third floor. Sometimes they don't. So it's not really quite the shiny future environment that Microsoft would have you believe, but this is sort of the concept behind Office 365 in general, right? So that's the general theme of it, but what is it that Office 365 actually does? Because it's obviously a proliferating set of tool sets, and we actually tried to map this out using an evaluation of different employee services that a platform like Office 365 could serve and fulfill, and then map those against the different tool sets within Office 365 and kind of evaluate how they do. So we put together this huge diagram that's part of our research. I won't go into all the details. You'll need to subscribe to our research to find out how we ended up doing these scoring. But the idea here is that you've got all these enterprise and team-oriented individual services running down the left-hand column here. And you have a wide variety of Office 365 capabilities. And what's interesting about this is that the first thing is that no single service, of course, accommodates all of these. SharePoint has a lot of pie charts here, but a lot of them we're only giving them a 1, which means it's kind of below average at it. But the key thing here is that there are a lot of different circles here and a lot of wide variance in terms of effectiveness. So there's a lot of overlap, but also some gaps here as well. So it can be kind of difficult to sort of place what different employee services or digital workplace services do I want to assign to which Microsoft services. I mean, there are people writing books on this. There's whole conferences on this topic. And so I'm not going to purport to give you specific advice here, but I'm going to say that our research is sort of pointing towards certain tools are better at other things than others, right? So let's talk about the overall findings for the suite as a whole. So, let's first always talk about the strengths. It's a broad set of services that can enhance your productivity. And that's really the whole idea here. So they sort of extended productivity from just the desktop suite out into the broader cloud. Microsoft has localized the platform in dozens of languages. This is potentially a really big deal for you. That's why I've got the little angel there. This is a really good thing. It's an issue with some of their pure play competitors who sometimes don't support multiple languages. The storage and security can often, not always, but often exceed what companies can do on premise, right? So that's the whole promise of the cloud. It includes many advanced services that are not available or planned for on-premises deployments, is particularly, of course, the case with Exchange and SharePoint. And it's always up to date. It may be too up to date. We'll get to that in a second, but it is always up to date. You may need to invest in add-ons, but for the most part, customers can look to Redmond for enhancements. This is a little bit debatable, but the idea here is that Microsoft is sort of saying, all right, we're hopefully going to reduce your reliance on the overall ecosystem. But now let's talk about the weaknesses, and there are obviously many. And the first is that new features are released frequently, and that these new features are very often sort of under-tested. I think Microsoft overshot shared from Google here. And some of these new features could really have used more testing, and they will reduce the performance or create issues. There's really confusing communication channels, and the speed of releases can cause support and management challenges. And part of it is that there really isn't an Office 365 product group. There are different product teams that are working still fairly independently, and this causes all kinds of heartache and grief for licensees. Several services are now connected, but the functionality may not be always accessible or visible. So this is not a unified platform. This is a platform trying to connect different pieces together into some sort of a coherent solar system, but it's not a coherent solar system now. For many advanced features, you are going to require Windows 10, the enterprise mobility, the security suite, maybe an E5 license. So there's a lot of hidden costs here, and you need to be careful about getting sandbagged. And so that's really the next bullet here, which is pretty bad, is that sometimes there's hidden licensing impacts where to get the services you need, you need a higher degree of licensing and then greater spend. The bigger issues here really around user experience. Microsoft doesn't talk about this a lot, but the general assumption here is that you're sort of handing off your user experience to them. So you kind of have to accept those user experiences as is. And so then the question is, did Microsoft really conceive of these journeys the same way that you did? And if they didn't, then you're really in kind of a problem here, because the different products tend to be feature rich, but they're somewhat application poor, which means you don't have a lot of specific applications like communities or workplace portals or internet in a box. And so you've got to kind of craft these things yourself or turn to third parties to do that. And that, we have seen, can also get pretty ugly. Now let's take a deep dive on one of the specific products. So we'll look specifically here at Office 365 groups. And this is just an example of some of the analysis that we have about 13 of these different offerings. So groups, fairly easy to provision, arguably too easy to provision, definitely light in terms of some of the provision management services. In many cases, groups get auto-provisioned when you set up other things like in Teams, or sometimes Yammer or SharePoint. Underneath, you may be creating something like a new team, but underneath, often a new group gets created as well. So you have to really be aware of that. It is a kind of a unified discussion platform. It has some limits here in terms of, when you're creating one, you can set it for public access or private access. What you'd really want here is to be able to align this a little bit more closely with your Active Directory. You can kind of do that behind the scenes. Really, what we've seen some frustration around is this sort of selection between public and private often is too coarse-grained. But they are easy to provision, and that's a demerit, but also a benefit. But let's look more generally at the pros and cons. So, as I mentioned, the first strength, very easy to provision, right? If you have to authorize end users who need to quickly spin up a discussion space, you can even do it right from within Outlook. It does include many enterprise services, maybe not as many as you'd like, but in general, Microsoft is pretty good about this in terms of, to some extent, naming policies, certainly expiration policies, hidden membership, data labels and controls, some e-discovery support, and so forth. So all the sort of enterprisey things you would expect from a large vendor. It is integrated, although not as well as you would like, with Yammer, Teams, and Planner, and of course some discovery via Graph. And really the core strength is that it offers persistent and searchable discussion. Right, that's the whole purpose of groups, that you can integrate with shared files, shared mailbox, shared calendar, and so forth. And the idea here is that they should replace these sort of email listservs that are, which can become very evanescent and not very readily searchable. But now let's talk about some of the weaknesses. So first is, there's definitely a gap in conversation integration among groups, Yammer, and Teams. You have, and this is causing all kinds of grief, that you really have these different styles of interaction that have different types of discussion services, and it can be very, and sometimes all in the same product, and it can be very difficult to suss out, like, when do I use what? And Microsoft offers some very vague guidance around this, but we're seeing almost endemic confusion around this. And that means that you're going to need to plan for mismatches as departments, provision the wrong tool for the wrong use case. One thing that's particularly ugly is the complete absence of community management and facilitation services. We know that communities are the tip of the social spear within the enterprise. We know for a fact that community management and facilitation is essential to be successful for internal communities of practice and communities of interest, and Microsoft has simply ignored that completely, and that's why many organizations who have thriving communities often suffer when they get forced to get pushed into Office 365. Some services like Yammer and Teams do not easily surface advanced group functionality like the shared calendar. And so there ends up being kind of a cobbled together UX as Microsoft tries to integrate all these different things. And I don't think that problem's going away anytime soon because, again, many of these products are off on their own kind of roadmap. And there are some enterprise information management services that you may see, like in a SharePoint, that go missing here, particularly in terms of, a workflow behind the provisioning or other sorts of things that I think we've been able to do in SharePoint, but still not so much in groups. So if you're looking in terms of fit for groups, definitely for internal mailing lists. You want to really replace your internal mailing list with groups. They provide basic discussion forums, unmoderated or unmanaged communities of practice or interest. Again, do you really want an unmanaged community of interest is a tough question to ask. And ad hoc collaboration that's not real time, with an emphasis on information sharing and persistence for search. It's a poor fit when your enterprise has really made a lot of investments in Yammer as your main ESN and Teams-based grouping. Knowledge workers who are collaborating on sort of more formalized, repeatable, and document-heavy projects will probably want to turn to SharePoint Online, even though the discussion services aren't great there. Like any other product, if the size gets larger or too small, you probably want to go somewhere else, in this case, Yammer or Teams. And then the other thing about groups is that it automatically creates all kinds of other artifacts along with it, including a team site and some others. And so this creates a lot of heft and bulk and cruft and extra stuff in your digital workplace that many organizations simply don't want. So if you look at sort of what are your competitors here, obviously you have IBM with Connections, although that now has been sold off to the systems integrator HCL. Google offers some similar services, although not quite as robust, and Oracle still sort of has an oar in this water. It's more interesting around terms of major suites where we see some social collaboration capabilities certainly built in within Drupal. There's some particular Drupal distributions that are particularly good at this. Atlassian kind of making a play here. Jive used to be sort of the default system for communities of practice. It's been sold off now. It is in kind of a tailspin, so we would suggest you avoid that. But Telligent is an interesting .NET-based platform that does offer communities technology as well, and might be worth looking at if you're really serious about communities of practice or communities of interest within your digital workplace. That's a deep dive on groups. More to say there, probably more to share, but it kind of gets you the sense, okay, we're looking at this as a particular service. What is it good at? What is it not good at? What's a good fit for? What's it not a good fit for? Now let's talk about some Office 365 trends. So the first one that we're describing is de-SharePointization. So we made that term up, de-SharePointization, which is a number of capabilities that previously you would have relied on in SharePoint are now being broken out into other sorts of more fit for purpose, arguably more modern cloud-based services, including Flow for simple workflows and business processes, Power Apps for simple applications, Teams certainly for more real-time collaboration, and Stream for video handling. There's a screenshot from Flow where you've got a variety of different templates about how to process Office 365 documents and put them through simple workflows and that sort of thing, often including SharePoint, but you're actually building these in Flow. So in general, I think this is a good thing. SharePoint was kind of a bloated platform. I think it's probably good that the scope is kind of being skinnied down to more document and records management and simple collaboration around those files. But you should just be aware of it to the extent that you're making significant investments in SharePoint Online, that it's likely to become, like I say, a skinnier product going forward. Really interesting to see Microsoft focusing heavily on Teams. I think that they've made the bet that Teams is where you're going to hang out in Office 365. That to the extent that Office 365 is like this kaleidoscope of different products and services, with a lot of really complicated context switching among them. And if there's a single place I want to go to, almost dare I call it a portal, that Microsoft has decided that Teams is that place, not SharePoint, not Outlook, at least not Outlook anymore. It's likely to be Teams. So this is really interesting because Teams uptake has been somewhat so-so, particularly in organizations that already have Slack. We've seen pilots go on and bake-offs between Teams and Slack, and although Microsoft making some progress with Teams, typically Slack wins those if employees get to decide, and that's the key thing here. I mean, ideally, your employees should decide, right? For a variety of different reasons, including user experience, better integration, arguably better performance, all kinds of other things. But Microsoft is betting heavily that they can de-Slack your environment, and that in the Office 365 environment, if I'm going to bring things to you rather than you having to go out to this whole cornucopia of different products, I'm going to bring them to you in Teams. And the other thing about Office 365 that's interesting is that in a way it was kind of a reaction originally to SharePoint being this really heavyweight platform that just got too difficult and over customized, too difficult to upgrade, and really turning it into an online product that might have lower flexibility but a lot more maintainability. And that was really part of what was going on with Office 365, was to turn a platform into a more out-of-the-box product where you didn't have a lot of control over it, but it was just delivered to you as is. What's interesting about it, and this is really the third trend, is that it's starting to become a little bit more of a platform. We're starting to see some extension models and some third-party tools, albeit running in Azure, that are working on top of the various Office 365 product APIs. And so I think particularly with respect to employee-centric user experiences, we are all going to have to rely more and more, again, on third-party platforms that live above Office 365 and help us bring some coherence to this platform, because I don't think Microsoft themselves is able to do it. So we're in a situation where, yeah, it went from a platform to becoming a product, and now maybe it's becoming a platform again, particularly for those of you who are trying to develop more employee-centric workplace experiences. So that brings us then naturally to our next topic, which is Office 365 and your broader digital workplace. So we know from the digital world that you really need to do user-centric design, right? In terms of digital marketing engagement, people talk in terms of customer-centric design. We know that in a successful digital workplace, you want to do employee-centric design, where the employee is at the center. And in the yellow here, they have different ambitions, including ease, efficiency, effectiveness, recognition, growth, and that leads them to working on their own, their my work, working together, working better, and ideally out through specific applications, surrounded by this series of enterprise services in purple. So the goal here is that the employee is at the center of the digital workplace. And this really calls the question on user experience more generally, is that if you apply the same kinds of user experience paradigms that we've done in the external digital world, in the customer-centered digital world, then what it says is that you don't look at your systems and then go out to the screen. You start with your screen and then go back into your systems, and you try to create screens that really work for people, which is another way of saying it's employee-centered rather than enterprise-centered. And we have all kinds of methodologies that we already know that work for this, including user journeys and top tasks, doing contextual inquiries about what people really need, and that ideally personas and journeys drive all of your planning. And so what this means in Office 365 context is that you really need to focus very carefully on application-specific usage plans and guides. So if you're trying to do Y, then deploy X. It's still not going to be as good as if you had greater control of the user experience, but at least it's a start. Definitely explore the potential for hub sites and SharePoint to serve as kind of mini portals into some of these experiences. And you should definitely continue to consider third-party add-ons or alternatives for key services, because Office 365, although it's sold as a coherent and comprehensive platform, is inconsistently good at the things that it does, is inconsistently integrated, and is not really a holistic experience. So if you're caring about being employee first, then you have to have the flexibility to look at alternatives, whether those are add-ons or literally competing products for certain key things that are really important for you. So don't be this guy, right? Don't wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to, deploy Office 365. But you really want to be this guy who's like, I don't know, which service should I use? Like really sort of empathizing with your colleagues and your fellow employees, like not just, hey, let's deploy Office 365 and see the value we can get out of it, but look at what does this employee actually need? And this is really, we're talking about the future of the employee experience here, right? So in the future experience, there's a number of things we're going to want, and that requires you to not have a passive Office 365 strategy, but a proactive Office 365 strategy. So the future is not just some lame intranet with some collaboration. There's a true digital workplace, then you need to start with employee personas and journeys and have those drive your strategy. And then if you have UX-driven product roadmaps here, then you're going to need to be prepared to supplement Office 365 because it may not be able to fulfill those roadmaps. If the future means more embedded services, then you're probably going to have to learn the Office 365 APIs to be able to embed some of those Office 365 services in other environments. You definitely want to build a flexible stack, and so that may mean, again, potentially pushing beyond Microsoft. The future digital workplace is going to be a lot more integrated, so I think we're all going to have to keep pressing Redmond here around being able to integrate Office 365 with other capabilities in your digital workplace. It's likely to be a collection of services, so you're going to need to use the Fight Club rule, which is don't mention Teams and SharePoint and Group. Instead, think of them as services and try to build them out as services. And then, in the future means really experimenting with new capabilities and to be as employee-centric as you want. And so that means you're going to want to keep experimenting with new vendors, both within the Microsoft ecosystem and sometimes beyond the Microsoft ecosystem. So if you're going to be employee-centric, then what you really need to ask yourself is not why not Office 365, but why Office 365? What is it going to do for us? How is it going to help our employees be more effective and more efficient and more recognized, as opposed to, hey, we licensed this Office 365 thing, it's a sunk cost, what can we get out of it? That's totally backwards. So that was a brief tour, some of the highlights in our research. I encourage you to download a free sample. You can get it at realstorygroup.com/try. It shows you some samples of some of our SharePoint research as well as other services. If you have any questions about how we can help you be more effective, certainly feel free to reach out to us at this email or at these phone numbers. And our mission in life is to help digital leaders be more effective by making really good decisions. And so if we can help you be a more effective digital leader, please feel free to reach out to us. And so in the meantime, this is Tony Byrne with Real Story Group, thanking you for participating and wishing you a fantastic new year. Bye now.